is our third in a series of programs. And today we'd like to deal with precognitive information, and specifically we'll use the L10-11 plane crash back in 1985 to help people to understand the psychological and spiritual aspects of coping with precognition.
Interesting. Can I listen? Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Kenneth Ring at the University of Connecticut, through many questionnaires and many hours of private type conversations, asked me many questions, most of which I was unfamiliar with. In other words, had I ever heard of a precognition? Well, certainly I had, but I never delved into it at all. And then eventually when he questioned me on, Tom, could you give us an example of a retrocognition, a precognition, and possibly something clairvoyant, my immediate reaction was laughter. And I used the word stupid. I really meant ignorant, but I said the word stupid, and I said, gee, Ken, don't you realize how stupid that is? And what I was really thinking of was that these researchers were very ignorant, because they, in fact, obviously knew nothing at all about clairvoyance, retrocognitions, and precognitions, because my immediate reaction was, well, Ken, there's no such thing as a precognition and a retrocognition. There are only different functions of clairvoyance. And I said, if you have a precognition of a very detailed event or subject or something like that, you are only functioning clairvoyantly, and you have picked clairvoyantly something that is, as we perceive time, ahead of time, or future. The same with retrocognitively. Past life regression oftentimes are retrocognitive, as opposed to zeroing in on your personalized past life. They are retrocognitive, and you are functioning clairvoyantly, and you are pulling out many personalized and spiritual details of another life. So sometimes we have to be careful of those things. At any rate,
You mean a life that was not your own?
Yeah, in other words, may or may not be your own. So the caution there is you have to really delve into what is it that you are functioning at, say, in a past life regression. Were you regressing to your personalized past life, or were you regressing to a clairvoyant state that allowed you to go to another person's life at another time? And it's curious to see that we usually, by power of suggestion, go backwards in time. It would be more curious to see the result of the same people, same practitioners, the same recipients to do that and purposely decide to go ahead of time. To see if they would be as receptive as I'm saying that they are clairvoyantly forward or future in time. In other words, to either their future life or just future events. Well, as you said, we'll use the example of a plane crash. There's several things that I want to say as we start this, and that I need to be chastised because in this whole event I made some very, very remarkable mistakes, mostly on a personal level. First of all, having had this precognition of a tragic nature, of a plane crash, involving my favorite passenger airplane, which I often champion, also becoming extremely personally involved with the information that came one night while being interviewed at the University of Connecticut. And by personally involved, I mean way overly involved on a personal level, on a semi-spiritual level. Notice I don't know if I'll delve into that too much, but very bluntly, I really took on more than what I should have. I'm being judgmental about myself, saying that now humanistically, as well as psychically, as well as spiritually. In other words, I pushed things to the limit. I demanded of myself that which I really shouldn't have delved into. In other words, the extent or the extreme. I didn't really do anything bad or wrong. In other words, I shouldn't be put in jail. But as a result of the little bit of greed that I demanded of myself, in other words, I became a little too greedy at times, a little too demanding, and so on, I reaped the harvest of what I sowed.
And caused yourself the pain.
Well, very much so. A lot of pain, a lot of disruption, a lot of heartache, as well as a lot of, how can I describe it, intellectual responsibility, spiritually speaking. I'll get into that later, but I wanted to summarize kind of what we'll try to cover here.
You were aware of that, about a year and 7 months before the actual crash?
Yeah. I don't recall the exact day, but it was in middle of October of 1983. And as typical, if you've seen any of my tapes or talked to me, be careful quoting me on exact dates. But as best I can recall, it was October of 83, and that we now know that the event took place in the summer of 85.
August 2nd of 85.
All right, August 2nd. Because I'm still not sure of the exact dates when it was so important as to zeroing it in as best I could, the timing of the event, which was only, it was to the tune of 2 weeks prior to the event. I tried very hard to come up with a date. I wasn't able to come up with either the number, in other words, the Monday, Tuesday, or the number day, but I just, as best I could regarding that season, I said something to the effect that it will have had happen sometime between the 1st of, the 1st of July, and it will have had taken place before my birthday. But then I corrected that, and I said, in fact, thinking of that framework in time, that it will happen exactly halfway between that time, never realizing that that meant it had to happen within 72 hours. It was in a very short period of time, or certainly that week. And I wasn't aware of that for the next couple of days. The people in the room were aware of that, and being as polite as they were, they didn't say something like, but Tom, that means within the next couple of days. I'm sure that they did that on purpose, knowing that that would have upset me tremendously. So, thank them for that. At any rate, back in October, a year and a half prior, the scene basically was one of my roundtable discussions, again, a 72-hour dialogue, where I would just arrive at the University of Connecticut at the famous near-death hotel, and whoever would show up or whoever would be there, either sometimes I would be invited because somebody would be there, or I would be there and then people would just come in knowing that I was there and would be able to ask questions about my near-death experience and other related subjects. So the day before, and it was the daylight hours, I was introduced to a couple of scientists and physicists, and we chatted about related subjects. And then as the night hours came, as it went in after the typical lasagna dinner that, in other words, if you've ever been in the near-death hotel, you only have lasagna because it's the only thing that you can divide into 100 pieces or 3 pieces. And it was the dish of the near-death hotel. Read Heading Toward Omega if you don't know what the near-death hotel is, or borrow the book and read just the first couple of chapters. At any rate, in the near-death hotel we were talking, and as Ken Ring said of me, just ask Tom a question, he'll get on a roll, and it'll happen. And what he meant by that is, you might have to suggest the subject matter, and then I'll just take off with my big mouth and talk with many details about it. So as it turned out, I just happened to be talking about the life and times of Jesus Christ in much more detail than I would have ever expected that I would have in 1983. So I was on a roll, and I was very comfortable and enjoying myself, and the people that were taping and listening to me were enjoying the evening. Now, it's also typical in those conversations that there'll be side conversations. In other words, 2 or 3 people will hear what they want, they'll ask me a question and hear what they wanted to hear from me, and then they'll discuss among themselves implications, or that will lead to another subject. And so there just happened, to the right of where I was sitting, 4 women, one of whom was Norma Krenzel, the mistress of the near-death hotel and the international hugger of the world, a title that I still give to her. One of the first strangers that I ever hugged in my life at 33 years old. So, I mean, she's important, for that. She has that title and so on. And I've always been very comfortable being in her company and so on. She's one of those few people that you can talk to and not feel as though you have to pretend or put on ears or protect her ears. Or so she and 3 other women were talking about a movie and or a book. And one of the titles, as best I can recall, that most people are familiar with, is The Ghost of Flight 401. Now that's basically the way I understand it. I haven't read the book, of course. Haven't read it, but it's about the ghostly apparitions of the pilot of a plane that crashed in the Everglades. I don't recall what year, but say 4 or 5 years ago, or a few years before.
Before 1983.
Yeah. Oh, we're almost the turn of the century now. Okay. As a matter of fact, what is today's date? So we should say it.
Today is the 24th of
October of '89.
1989.
Okay. I know where we are. All right, so we're talking about something that's at least 4 years ago, and then we're jumping to 5.5 years ago when this came to my mind as a precognition. Well, they were talking about this book or the movie, and I wasn't listening to them at all. I mean, I wasn't eavesdropping. But it is typical of me, even though I'm talking very intently and very rapidly about a certain subject, if you, within my hearing range, say a non-truth, I call it a lie. But if you make a mistake, for instance, I might still call it a lie, and I mean it lovingly, that's intolerable to me. And if I know any information to correct you, I'll stop talking and interrupt you and correct you. In other words, it's done with love. It's not done as, hey, you can't lie in front of me. I mean, there's no arrogance involved. It's just that that's happened many times, and I don't know if it is a characteristic of mine or if it's just that I'm so, the actual truth is so important to me that fine details are very important, and that you should strive very much for the absolute truth as opposed to an assumption or something like that. Well, they were discussing the ending of the book or the ending of the movie, where the last apparition of that, the ghostly apparition of the pilot of the plane that crashed in the Everglades, made the statement to one of the airline stewardesses that there will never be another crash of an L10-11. And see how he said it without becoming emotional. That was the statement. In other words, again, the statement was, there will never be another crash of an L10-11, period. Well, as that was experienced originally, the misconception by the general population was that there will never be another crash of that type of plane. But my understanding, rather instantly by hearing them at that point say that and why it was wrong, was that, first of all, they didn't understand what the ghostly apparition meant by that. Now, the pilot in the book and in the movie, the Flight 401, what he meant was, in his time, there will never be a crash of one of his planes. He's personally involved, he's spiritually involved, he's on the other side, he's dead, but he's earthbound, if you will, I'll use that phrase. And in his time, while he's in this condition, he will do whatever's necessary to assist and protect his airplanes, meaning Lockheed L10-11 TriStars. In his time, he was also earthbound. Now, this is a judgmental statement on my part. I don't know if there's been any writing or anything about this, but I'm telling you this from information that I have. That he was earthbound by an uncontrolled desire to be rectified in the responsibility of the plane crash. He was the pilot. Right away, the investigation pointed to the finger that he was not at his post at the controls when the plane crashed, that he was in the underside, the belly of the plane. And it took a very long time for the investigators to prove all the circumstances that he did not do something wrong to create that plane crash, that it was an actual accident, that the plane and the pilot and the co-pilot were all victims of circumstances that were very strange and unique, if you will, and that they did follow proper procedure, but there were some mistakes made inadvertently. In other words, it wasn't, they couldn't blame them, couldn't find fault with them. So in that time frame, which I don't recall, but I'm sure that it was more than a year, there were many events where the ghostly apparition appeared to stewardesses on the planes where there were parts from that crash plane recycled or reused. And one event, just to give you an idea so this isn't too confusing, was that the ghostly apparition, the pilot, appeared to one of the stewardesses and announced that go to the pilot of the plane that is flying and tell him to land at the nearest airport, that there is going to be a fire. But if he lands at the nearest airport right now, there will be no problem, no loss of life, and the plane will be okay, and so on. If this is ignored, then there will be a problem with the plane. Conceivably, the plane could catch on fire and crash. So the stewardess went rather fanatical because she'd never seen a ghost before. So instead of really listening to what she had to say and the information that there will be a fire aboard this plane, and that if you're on a runway or at an airport, it can be just taken care of normally, she got so frantic that they decided that they should land the plane at the nearest airport to get her off the plane. That was for her protection and the well-being of the passengers. So they landed the plane. This is documented in history. You know, you can look it up however you're able to look something like that up. And the plane landed, and while they were getting her off the plane and giving her a barbiturate or something, or calming her down, the radar element in the very nose of the plane burst into flame. Well, to have something like that happen, what it does, it just creates a little bit of smoke. So naturally, alarms would go off and so on. Now, if it was in flight, conceivably that would continue to burn, and it would catch the plane on fire and create a disaster, conceivably a disaster. But being on the runway, they simply open the nose of the plane, take the element out, blow a little of the smoke out of the way, put a new element in it, close it up, check it out, and it's okay to fly. So the flight, other than the interruption of landing, didn't have to be postponed, or I don't even believe that the passengers had to be taken off the plane. So the plane was saved, if you will, by the information from the ghost. All right, that set the scene. Now, the statement that they said was, there will never be another crash in L10-11. Well, in the middle of my conversation, I just stopped right away and turned right toward them, and I said with a great deal of emotion, but that's not true. And then blurting that out loud, I realized what I'd said out loud. In other words, this was subconscious or just spontaneous. Right away in my mind, I realized in order for me to say that, I have to know that there will be another crash on an L10-11. And of course, that just shut my throat right off like that, and I put my head down and started to cry. The emotions involved in that, in other words, the sensationalism of it, I didn't like. I mean, to say just do that, I didn't even like the idea of doing that. And I wish I could have just said, oh, never mind.
Yeah.
But of course, I said that much, and they were now silent and just looking at me.
Everybody was waiting for more to be said.
And of course, Dr. Kenneth Ring, in his psychology voice, the psychologist that he is, he lowers his voice and gets more intelligent-like, and he says, well, Tom, obviously what you've said is, and so I just looked at him and I said, Ken, knock off the psychology talk, this is just me. But I then got up from the table and I walked out onto a balcony and collected myself for a few minutes. And I came back, and then Ken very lovingly, carefully hinted, Tom, is there anything that you would wish to add to what you said? And then he did say, I would like to ask a couple of questions. And the two questions were the flip side of, well, for you to say that, isn't it obvious that you're actually saying that you know of the probability of that type of plane crashing, or is it in fact that you are aware of? And of course, again, my emotions swelled, but I just sat there and waited long enough. And inside me, I mean, my heart was pounding, and I mean, I wanted to tell everybody everything. And at the same time, this is all crazy, so I can't say anything. In other words, psychologically, emotionally in me. At the same time, I was dealing in my mind with cause and effect relationships. Is this right for me to be talking about? In other words, not just emotionally and psychologically, but spiritually, I have a lot of information that at most times I can't just blurt out and share with people. And I mean, you're aware of that, and many of the people that have talked to me before have to be aware of that. So I was dealing with that, and it took several minutes. I did state many things. I'll try to recall the way I said it too. Because I said, well, there will be, and I had to cover my face up, you know. I just cried and I said there will be, because also remember, this is my favorite airplane, and this is hurting my feelings to be suddenly aware of that my favorite airplane is going to have another crash. And so, again, time delay and some emotions, and then I said, but some of it is so confusing to me. And then I swore. I used to swear a lot in those days. I swore, and I was damning myself because, among other things, I was saying, why do I have to know this? I know so much, meaning about the details of the crash. I know so much, but yet I'm contradicting myself. And see, I haven't even given the details, but I'm dealing with it, and I'm saying these half sentences out loud. I blurted out several things, and I don't have them in the right order necessarily, but one of them was, how can I be knowing this? And what I meant was, how can I be seeing this perfectly clear? How am I knowing this, but I can't see the white building clear? Now, I was questioning my ability that if I can see something ahead in time, then that's it. There's no question about that, and it's that. And that if I can know it, then that means I'm seeing it perfectly clear. But it's as though my vision was blurred or blocked. And why can't I identify this white building that's very important to me? In other words, it would be desirous of me to know what this white building is, where it is, and so on regarding the plane crash. And I said white building. I didn't say gas tank or metal object or white round disc or, you know, I didn't say any of those things. I said white building. So that technically was a mistake. As far as, again, I said building, and it wasn't a building. In hindsight, it turned out to be a tank. I also said, how can I know it's 103 degrees? I said it just like that. How can I know that it's exactly 103 degrees, and yet I don't know when or where it is?
Outside.
Right, and the frustration of that was the two main questions, when and exactly where. So I'm damning myself for not knowing that, and yet I know many details. In that conversation, at that time, in that conversation, it was about, by that time it was about 3:30 in the morning. And I looked at Ken and I said, Ken, you know, Ken, you know, I know all the people. That was about the worst part of it, because it's always been a frustration of mine. I like people.
Yeah.
And how can I know people so personally and privately and intimately and be able to deal with them that 90% of them will die? Now, their death doesn't bother me, but why do I have to know it?
Right.
See, because you know, philosophically, it's okay to die. You have permission to die in a natural way, or in a tragedy or something like that, other than suicide. In other words, it's really okay to die. I'm eagerly anticipating my own death. There's even, kind of chaotically, a little bit of jealousy. When I know of people dying, I have a certain feeling of loneliness.
Yeah.
Because they're moving on to where I've had a glimpse of, where I've been, and I can't be right now, and I miss that. So that loneliness, or jealousy, if you will, I was also experiencing at the same time. But Ken asked me a question, and I said, and I kind of almost sarcastically, like, snapped back at him, and it was to qualify. I said, Ken, I can read you off their first names. And I said that like a scientist, because he asked a question about, well, how can you know them? Something like that. I don't recall the exact words. Some other details were, of course, that it was a Lockheed L10-11 TriStar. And I said, then a quick statement. I said, they're so beautiful, and do you know how many people they carry? Which, of course, swelled up the emotions again, because I was then thinking of the people. Well, there were several other statements about details. I was damning myself because I could see the airport, but the contradiction was the plane did not crash at an airport. Now that's a contradiction. So what's wrong with me that I can see the airport, I can see the runway, and I can see what it looks like from that angle, but I know that the plane crashes in a muddy field, and that it also hits this white structure, this white building that I said. And it doesn't make sense that, how can I know it's at an airport, but it doesn't crash at an airport? Contradiction of terms. Also, I was then very, very frustrated, and I'm sure nobody understood me in that room that day, that how can I know all these people? And then I interrupted myself and said, and there's also a person that dies that doesn't belong. Now, I didn't say it that clearly either. I mean, I was very, very emotional, and I was very frustrated by the fact that there's somebody who dies in this event that doesn't belong. Well, I knew a lot of details about who the person was, why, in other words, all the questions that you might want to ask me right now, like who was it and where was he and so on. I was dwelling on those aspects, and then I just said, I don't understand, I wasn't understanding. Why does he die in the plane crash, but he doesn't belong? So I then further qualified that, and I told Ken Ring later that night, that he wasn't on the plane, that he didn't belong. Ken Ring, I'm sure, and other people thought that I meant maybe he was a stowaway or something like that. But in fact, I was aware that he was in a car, in an automobile. He was also a mechanic. And so again, brotherly love, another fellow mechanic, and a really nice guy. So again, I can identify with him more so than the businessman on the airplane. Prejudice and bias comes in place because I'm functioning on an emotional, the psychological level as well. So a few other details, some very important details. That sort of ended that conversation that night. We did talk about other things. We got off the subject, and I talked right through the next day. So it sort of was shelved or subsided. I met with Ken Ring privately a month or so later, and he brought the subject up. And he asked some specific detailed questions, which I answered very accurately. We did not get through any more details about the frustration of the discrepancies, such as the white building, what was that? He did ask me, Tom, if you can see the airport, is it an airport? Is it an airport that you've been to before? And I said, I know that it's not. But then I started comparing, and I said, what I'm about to say isn't right. I was very cautious about that. But I said, of the airports that I've been to, it looks mostly like in either Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. And then I wasn't sure which. I said, well, it's the one with the water alongside it. In other words, there's ships there, so I think that's Philadelphia. Whichever one.
And it ended up to be Dallas?
Yeah, it ended up being Dallas. But again, with the white tanks at the ends of the runway, if you've ever been to the one in Pennsylvania, it looks a lot like that. Then he also said, when you also said something very specifically, and you said it several times, 103 degrees. What do you mean by that? And I said, well, it's very hot. I said, it's never that hot in Rochester, New York. And I said, also, that tells you that it has to be. Now, see, what I'm doing now is logical deductive reasoning with the initial precognition, which I caution people about because it often doesn't work. In other words, my frustration with how can I see a white building and not see it clear? So we talked several times, and then that was also one of the times where we were walking up the mountain road, Ken Ring and I, and he asked me the question, meaning spiritually speaking, or on the other side, in other words, after clinical death, or no matter what level you're on, or in heaven, he meant all of that. He said, Tom, on the other side, is there ever such a thing as a mistake? And I had a similar reaction, and I wasn't able to answer him for many minutes, and Ken Ring was good for that. In other words, he would just be patient. And then I finally nodded my head yes, and he didn't pursue it, being the friend that he was. And then it was probably 5 full minutes of walking further that I was able to say yes. And I just said, yeah. And then I couldn't talk anymore. And that was also very important around that time for, bear with me if I say my development. In other words, being able to rationalize and deal with things like this. Well, now what I want to add is, again, that was 1 year and 7 months roughly prior to the event. I was aware that it was not this coming hot weather. I often just say seasons. And of course 103 degrees would pretty well demand that it wasn't January or February. That it was in the United States, of course. It was 103 degrees Fahrenheit outside, which is an odd number, so it eliminated a lot of the usual airports. Excuse me, during that time I kept track of and watched airports on television. By the time this whole thing was over, 1.5 years later, I do have to admit, I don't know if Elaine should hear this, but I purposely I manipulated tickets that were paid for, and sometimes I can say, look, this is a direct flight, and I've got some spare time. Can you send me to a couple of different airports? And the people at the airlines were real helpful that way. And one time I went to 4 airports to get from Philadelphia to Rochester. I went all over the eastern seaboard. Well, what I was doing was to physically going and seeing. What I knew was, if I went to the place, I would be there. In other words, I would know it right away, and I would see it. And I've been sorry for that in hindsight. I mean, it wasn't to be, but still, an aspect where could I or should I have done more?
Okay. Tom, I think we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue through the several meetings that you had where a lot more details came out right up to and through the event.
Okay, good. Okay. Now, the test of the viewing audience is to see what's different about this picture. Well, my eyes might not quite be as bloodshot, but there is something else that's different about this picture. And it's a test to see if you notice the difference, because it's something that anybody who's seen me before should notice. Wouldn't you agree?
All
right. And if you're showing this film, you can stall for a second and make the announcement as to what the difference is. I won't give any hints, will I? Okay, now back to the subject. And we had talked about the conversations in Connecticut mostly, and the actual precognition as it took place, how it developed. Now it's from, in a way, the power of suggestion that somebody said a mistake about the general subject matter in regards to that particular plane and that subject that was wrong. So in correcting them, it brought to mind, if you will, my awareness of this upcoming precognitive disaster.
Now, Tom, did that trigger a memory of your life review?
Right. In this case, and this may be new to a lot of people, or just the realization of awareness, I have had happen to me just spontaneous precognitions, like, oh wow, do you know what's going to happen, or oh wow, what's happening now? Right, and that's one type, where for no apparent reason, or some ulterior motive that I may be involved in it or not involved or something like that in the future. But in this case, they saying a mistake, there will never be another crash in the L10-11, it was not a power of suggestion that I started thinking about L10-11s and then suddenly precognisizing the next plane crash of that type of an airplane. It didn't work like that. There is a characteristic with me, and I know of other people who have had a near-death experience, or say in a particular time in their life, a spontaneous spiritual awakening, where as a result of that their psychic ability has been greatly enhanced. They usually say enhanced. I'd like to say disturbed. Enhanced. So therefore we can blame it on my near-death experience, but part of my near-death experience was an attunement or at one-ment with total knowledge. And in the last stage or stages of my experience, it was, I've said the sense that I became totally homogeneous with the light. The light is total knowledge, therefore, for the splittest of second out of time, I was total knowledge. Well, I'm certainly not total knowledge now, It's a physical impossibility. And therefore, you know, I'm emphasizing total knowledge. So it would be true to say, if you experience total knowledge, you have to know everything. All right, so if at one time or out of time I knew everything, what I'm leading up to is, with the suggestion they said there will never be a crash in an L10-11, first I had to correct their mistake. But in order for me to correct that, I had to know that there would be another crash in an L10-11. As to where and when, that may or may not have been in my perception. The point I'm trying to bring up or get to is that as that took place, consciously I knew nothing about the next crash of an L10-11. I did not know about that from 1970, any time before. 1978, right through the conversation that was had in Connecticut. But to answer them, knowing that that's a lie, that that's a discrepancy, and I have to correct it. As I said that, that's not true, that came to my conscious level many of the details of the fact that there will be another crash. And that if it's another crash, that next crash will be like this. Now, there's all that information flooded out. But what I'm saying is, what do we call it? Either that information was already stored or I was already aware of it on a very subconscious level, or shall we call it a superconscious level? Meaning the same thing as a subconscious level, but on a high enough level that things of that nature can be divulged. In other words, I certainly didn't learn that in school or in any time in my life. Out of my life or super consciously. Things can be learned in the same way in an extreme meditative state and not known after you wake up. But a week or 2 weeks later, a month or a year later, that information simply comes out and you know what to do. You know where to go, you know what to do, and that may even be confusing to you. So in this case, I'm claiming that this was knowledge that I had been exposed to, but that I didn't know. I didn't know on a conscious level at all. Wasn't aware of it. But as opposed to, say, somebody yelling out December 17th, like what happened to me one time, Ken Ring yelled out December 17th, and that date was the catalyst for me suddenly thinking in terms, like mathematically, the next December 17th, this, and this is going to happen. Now that happened, and I knew many things that were going to happen on that date. That was like the power of suggestion. And that could have been triggered spontaneously. Unlike this situation where the information was perceived during my near-death experience as part of the total knowledge, and now because I'm needing it or using it in the general subject matter, that information is surfacing to my conscious level. And in a psychic way, yes, but more in a spiritual way, that the total package was not just a wham, oh my goodness, a precognition of this nature. It was that now I'm certainly start to think of all this information that I have in me. It's also not saying that I've got all information in me. I say I can't claim that. I certainly never feel that way. And yet, in various circumstances, the right information surfaces now and then. It's the same as answering the question, well, if you're truly psychic, then what's going to happen tomorrow? Or if you're truly a psychic, then are you a psychic 24 hours a day? Which is ridiculous. Because, for instance, right now, I can know things, like, say, just by the desire of knowing that right now in Frankfurt, Germany, there is a yellow alert for the military. Now, that's because my baby boy is there, and that's happening in this time frame. Not this exact clock time, but today. Whatever today's date is, it would be today. And a rough figure within 24 hours of today even. All right, that can be manipulative, and I may or may not be able to do that. Such as just walking in our intermission that we just had, walking around, and just before we started up, I just thought, gee, I better make a phone call and call in the water break. which is taking place right now on Mount Ray Boulevard.
Or as such as the other night when you were calling me to tell me you could go to Sedona, and as you were dialing, you picked up the earthquake that was happening in California.
Right. Now, see, I don't remember that hardly at all. I remember calling you. So.
Well, what you said to me was, do you want the good news or the bad news?
Oh, now I remember.
And I said, give me the good
see,
news, and you said, I can't. The Bay Bridge is falling. And then you had to hang up.
Yeah, now I
remember.
Yeah. You know, again, we can even laugh at that.
Yeah.
But now, see, just then, I had not really blocked it out of my mind, but I had purposely forgotten that. Or, in other words, it wasn't in my mind at all. And that is typical of me to be, like, cute or sarcastic or funny when it's something very serious. I mean, it's one of the ways that I can deal with some things that are extremely emotional and so on. And the time frame of that phone call, well, in other words, I did say that.
Yeah.
Whoops. And then many other details, because that was also a major event. Well, now skeptics and so on will say, all right, if you know about an earthquake, then how come you missed the plane crash last week? Or how come you missed the Mount Etna blowing up? Yeah. And let me put it this way, if you're dealing with something like a major event, you can't be expected to know every leaf on the lawn right now, and in other words, where all three of your kids are right now, or in other words, if you're in tune or in a state of atonement or at one with anything, the highest probability is that you can't do anything else. That either just the focusing or the awareness, even if it's on a spiritual level, where I have said that you can do more than one thing at a time, but the probability is that you can't. Yeah. And that, let me put it this way, the result of this event, the plane crash, and the date that it happened, was, again, I don't know how many years from 1978, well, from 78 to 85, okay, so many years. In all that time, I've experienced many psychic things. This event was the first, and there have been two more since, but was the first time that I had to come home from work. Now that was major, because I promised publicly that the very first time that anything like this would interrupt my normal daily routine, meaning my work, my employment, or my family life, that, well, of course, a kind of silly statement I said that I'll shut up and I'll never say another thing out loud. Is, you know, we can laugh at that now but my intentions were that it's very important for nothing psychic to interrupt my employment. And in fact, I did have to come home from work the morning just prior to the clock time of the event in Texas. And what I did, I came home and I was a little distraught. I was extremely angry at myself because also time had run out, and that meant that unless I could make a quick phone call, I mean, even something as crazy as like call a bomb scare to try to get, but by that time the plane was already in flight. Yeah. And in other words, it was that realization that even though I decided that I wanted to do more than what I should have, and I took on more than what I should have, I was in the midst of that, and I still hadn't given up. And this was a realization that it's about to happen, and there's nothing that I can do. So I was angry at myself for failing, again, my judgmental that I failed, and then I was distraught over the intensity of the event, because it was a major event, a tragedy. Also my personalized spiritual and psychic and realistic psychological relationship with everybody aboard the plane and the mechanic and, again, the people involved mostly. And then also the sensationalism that I had actually produced by using it over and over and over again as analogies.
Right.
So the day of the event, I did have to come home, and in fact, it was also one of the very rare occasions that as a yell for help, nobody was home, and I needed somebody. It shouldn't have been Elaine, by the way. I mean, I would have only disturbed her, and I didn't want that. So I called the University of Connecticut Hospital and called Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's a very good personal friend of mine, and also just happens to be a psychiatrist. Well, he's involved in the research, and he was quite aware of many things that I had said about the plane crash ahead of time. So when I called him, he recognized my voice, but he also recognized the stress or distress and so on in my voice. And I was not speaking eloquently. So he said, Tom, I think I know why you're calling. You know, he said it fluently, and he said, trying to answer for me, because I wasn't really able to talk too well. He said, I think I know why you're calling. And then he said, is this the day? So I just said yes, and then we just held on the phone. Yeah. And I mean, that was perfect for me, and I appreciate he having to take that phone call even. In other words, it wasn't his job. I never paid him or anything like that. He took the phone call as a friend. And that was also very helpful. Well, so that's how emotional it was. And it was, up to that point in time, the most dramatic and traumatic for me. All right, now I want to backtrack because I want to get back on track and state that in the months between the precognition and the event that took place, what I had done incorrectly, I'm judging myself now and saying that I was wrong in using that event, that upcoming event, as an example of analogies of other things. In other words, if somebody in a group talk would say, Tom, give me the difference between a precognition of a tragic nature and something that you would feel very joyous about. Well, there are so many aspects of this plane crash that were negative and traumatic that I would give that as a quick example. Now, it wasn't up to me to claim that this was a real event that hasn't happened yet, because I didn't have the requirement to do that. I was only giving an analogy, but it's most comfortable for me to give facts rather than actually make up a hypothetical analogy, and that is typical of me on an ongoing basis. So what I did inadvertently at first, and then quite regularly, at least once every other month, in a group talk or even talking to a single person, I would say, well, let me give you an example. Let's say, for instance, there's going to be a plane crash. Now, if it's a big plane or this or that or that, in other words, I would go on with the details as the analogy, and it would work quite well. First of all, I'm using all the facts and phrases that were just that, and it would be easy for me to remember that, and I would be clever enough to give the facts and figures and yet not become emotionally or psychologically attached to the upcoming event. Well, this took place several times at Mary Ann's talks and Mary Ann and Joey's hairdressing salon, and where we'd have anywhere from 5 to 24 people show up just, to chit-chat back and forth. Sometimes we'd illegally call it a meditation. I mean, what's really funny is I have never meditated at any of my meditations. Again, what's in a word, what's in a phrase? It's really an excuse to get together and talk. So there was one fella, I think his name was it Chuck or Charles? Do you remember? Was it Charles, I think? All right, and I can't identify him right now, but I think it would be a good idea to look him up, because if he still has those notes, that could be used for research or investigation. At any rate, he had been to 3 or more talks in a row consecutively, and he had been taking notes in a spiral notebook, and he had personally asked a couple of questions, so directly to him I gave various analogies. So this one time I was complaining about my inability to deal with time accurately, and I mentioned that sometimes I can only figure out, well, it's the warm season. Or it's the warm weather of 1988. I'm kind of famous for having said that several times. or by the end of the warm season of '88. That was quite well known. So he then said, Tom, I'd like to make a statement if I can, and then I want to ask you a question. I said, oh, sure. He said, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but I've been to several of your talks in a row, and I've also been taking notes. And he said, and he went like this with a spiral notebook. And he said, here's what I think. He said, first of all, when you give analogies, very often you give analogies of a plane crash. Now what I think that you're giving not only an analogy of a particular plane crash and using the same one over and over again, but I think it's real. I think it's real and it hasn't happened yet. So I was shocked by that. Now I wasn't shocked that I was deceiving him all along and he caught me. I was doing this inadvertently. And I was not aware that it was typical of me to give an analogy and use this upcoming plane crash as the example. So then he rattled off a few things. He says, like for instance, when you're talking about temperature, being able to psychically be aware of the exact temperature, which is a mathematical computation, like you said, at this one plane crash, typically I might know that, and he smiled when he said that, he says, you say, I might know that it's exactly 103 degrees, but that on other events I'll only know it's either cold or warm. And then he rattled off a few more details. And he says, when you talked about something that's ambiguous, you gave the example that even right now you're not sure of a white building. You don't know if it's got windows or how tall or what, but it's a large white structure, and that you can't see it clearly. Things like that. So then he said, I think that this is a plane crash that you know about and hasn't happened yet. Now my real question for you is, the one thing that you've skirted and beat around the bush and tried, you seem like you try hard, but if you know this many details, I mean first name basis of everybody on the plane, and if you know that much, you have got to be able to either know or figure out exactly where or exactly when this is going to take place. And he said, can you do that? Now that was his real question. Well, all of the shocks took place in me, and then right away, again, he asked me a question, and it's typical of me to really try to answer any question anybody asked me. So I said, well, you know, you're really right. And I'm saying, you know, I've really been stupid about this thing about time. In other words, if I make it a priority, I should be able to at least do better. So I said, well, look, will you all just bear with me, and let me just think about the timing of this, and give me a few seconds. So I fervently pondered, and I really tried hard. I thought of calendars. I thought of ambiguously, vaguely, like, where are we now? Is this the warm season, or is this June or July? And then, you know, each thing wasn't working. So then I said, well, let me put it this way. Now, again, don't quote me on the exact dates that I'm going to give, because as I said it that day, I was exactly accurate. So I said something like, well, let me put it this way. It will happen sometime between the 1st of July of this year, but it will have to have had taken place by my birthday, which is the 1st of September. And however I said it, then I corrected myself. And, you know, when I go like this, it's usually emphatically, and then that's fact. That's not ambiguous. And I says, in fact, it'll happen exactly halfway between that time. Now, however my mind works or doesn't work well, I was accurate. In other words, I knew I was right, and it was halfway between that time I gave. And I was very satisfied that I zeroed in on the time frame that it would take place. Now, there was a problem regarding stating it that day, that time, because I wasn't aware of the date. In other words, as we were having this conversation, and this man asked me this question about time, typical of me, I wasn't aware of the calendar date. I could have figured out that it was July, but I didn't. And they were also very polite and compassionate, because I'm sure that all of the people in that room knew what I said, and the problem was with what I said was that it was already the second week in July that I was saying this. So if, in fact, and again, never mind the math, the exact dates. But if I said it would happen from the 1st of July to the end of July, and I'm stating it in the second week in July, and then I state emphatically that it will be exactly halfway between that time, that means that it's only 48 or 72 hours possible to go before the event. Now, I wasn't aware of that. In other words, I wasn't aware of what I really said. Because I stated a fact, but I wasn't aware of where I was in time right then. So nobody blurted out, but Tom, that's less than 3 days from now. So that whole conversation ended that evening. And I went home not being aware at all of, we've only got 72 hours to go before this will have had taken place. Which only added to the frustration when I suddenly became aware of the day of the event. Now, basically what happened, the details don't matter that much, but I woke up that morning and went to work. Now, I opened the front door to my house and was walking out to leave, and the newspaper fell down that was in between the storm door and the door. Now, that is before the plane crashed. Excuse me. But I experienced seeing that newspaper fall down, and it sort of like told me, it was as though I had a slight image, if you will, of the newspaper as that newspaper would appear the next day. I mean, of course, it has to be the day after of the event in order to get it on the front page of the newspaper. And there was nothing at all on that newspaper that I was looking at, really. It was just the falling of the newspaper. Maybe it was just the timing that I was woke up enough and I was going to work that maybe it was a subconscious awareness that this wasn't going to be a good day for me. So I realized that, and then out loud, even though there was nobody around, I said, oh shit, this is the day. I'm remembering too much. And it was distressing, but then I said, right away, caught myself and said, oh well. And that's, I can never explain that. In other words, how can I ever say, oh well, and just go on with something else, like go and run a bulldozer in a landfill? But I went to work, and I was mulling it over in my mind, that, well, this has to be, and there's nothing that I can do about it. In other words, the original precognition also stated that the fact is that an L10-11 will crash, and that I'm aware of it, and that certain details have to be. I don't know if we'll have time for this conversation to go into some aspects where there were some variables that I could take a certain amount of responsibility to cushion or facilitate or something like that, which would make it a little bit easier for somebody. Say, to just go and hug somebody that has to deal with it on a psychological level would be a loving gesture and would make it that much easier than if I were not aware of it. So I went to work, and then I've already stated that, and I'm not recalling right now because I'm confusing this with another event that around 11 o'clock, I think that I have this accurate regarding my awareness around 11 o'clock in the morning, our time, that this was the day, and I was getting a little disturbed by running the loader at the time. So I parked the loader, and I went down and made arrangements for my replacement and told my boss that I'm just not feeling well. It was very important to me because, see, I'd never excused myself from work. In other words, this was a major event in my life at the time to be either spiritual, psychic, or emotional enough to disrupt my job. My job was very important to me. And to not be in control and to have this take place. So I just stated to him that I would have to leave for the rest of the day, and my boss is very understanding, especially the fact that by this time he had been aware that I'm usually dealing with things other than running bulldozers and loaders, that a majority of the time I may just be concentrating on quantum physics. And he's compassionate enough and understanding enough to know that if I make some kind of a silly request like, can I just sit down for 15 minutes, other than a coffee break, he'll never refuse me. He'll instantly say, "Sure, Tom," and he'll say, "Do you want me to hang around or you want me to leave?" So my good buddy and friend and boss, Fred Easton, is very instrumental in a great deal of my comfort regarding my employment. So at any rate, then I came home and I've already stated that I called Bruce Grayson on the phone and that the event took place. Now, I have to be honest and say that I'm very surprised that other researchers were very aware of the precognitive aspects of it when they obviously saw it on the news and heard it, did not call me. I'm being honest, because I was also dealing with, oh my God, now it's taken place and I've shot my mouth off so much. I mean, and I was really down and out because oh my God, what have I really done? I mean, this plane crash had to take place, but I've shot my mouth off to dozens of people. I mean, dozens. I don't even know how many. And then I'm trying to remember how much did I tell this person or that person. Or now that this is going to be on the news, people are going to see it and say, oh my God, remember Tom was talking about the plane crash and he said that it would ricochet off a white building or it would land in the mud but not in an airport, or there was any detail that could only be associated with the actual event. In other words, in hindsight of the event, then the examples that I gave, the analogies, they're going to say, Tom Sawyer was talking about this months ago. Or so I was kind of saying, oh my God, the phone's going to start ringing. And then I have to be honest and say I was disappointed that the phone didn't ring off the hook. I got a few calls, but I wasn't deluged by physicists or, it was like people from the universities that I've been associated with. I was actually surprised, delighted in a way, because I don't think that would have been the best thing either for me. Might have been helpful to them in their research and so on, or just their, gee, I want to verify this with Tom. I can understand that, but so it turned out better that I didn't get deluged by phone calls. But then in the next couple of months, several people and many people, I did have another talk at Marianne and Joey's, and that was very emotional and so on, and I didn't deal too much with too many things. And I can recall vaguely, very ambiguously, coming in and saying, I don't know if I'll be able to talk about recent events, and I know that's on your mind, but just bear with me. We'll talk about other things, and I'll see if I can get into it. And of course, it was close enough time that the people that were to eventually die, several of them were in the hospital and still alive. In other words, they were dying of burns and smoke inhalation and things like that, in comas. And I was very, very aware of those people. So to say anything at all until, how dare I say something like the final count be made. Right. And then I was also very, very in tune with and attached to, and I'll say incorrectly so, overly attached to, people, individuals who survived. I'm trying hard to say it.
But had to go through a great deal of pain in the process.
I guess what I was really trying to say might be for another conversation, but if you are really aware of something in the future, you or anybody, I mean, clairvoyantly aware or spiritually aware, there are sometimes opportunities to, in one way or another, and judgmentally facilitate something as a love gesture. In other words, can we love the families of people who experience trauma or tragedy or the loneliness of bereavement, of death? Well, yes, we can. Excuse me. Can I, in Rochester, New York, spiritually or psychically hug somebody in a plane crash right now and make their life a little bit better, or they're passing on to death, what we call death, make their passing a little easier. In other words, does anybody have the ability to spiritually hug somebody and say, you are in the process of dying, but I want to tell you that you're not alone and it's okay? And the answer is yes. Not only yes, have I ever done that, and have I gotten a great deal of joy from doing that, but I mean, anybody can do that. In other words, in your state of fervent prayer, if you're not psychic or you don't have any major thing to claim towards psychic abilities and this, that, you can psychically or spiritually hug people that are far, far away from you, that you don't even know personally. You've never met, you never will meet. You have the ability to do that, and it makes the world go around a little easier. Well, now that I've gotten that out, I'm kind of proud of what I just said. Some of that took place.
I know recently when we were beginning to tape before, the movie was being talked about that depicts this whole incident called Fire and Rain.
Yeah, that was the
People
title.
had the opportunity to see that. You said they handled everything quite accurately as far as the detail.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that they had taken, for sure, the dialogue off the flight recorders, because in that particular movie, which we saw part of just a few minutes ago, some of the minor discrepancies that made it more comfortable for me to watch the movie. You can imagine how I would watch that movie compared to anybody else. And even if I dare say a family member of somebody who died on that plane crash, they certainly watched that movie also. And whereas it may have been traumatic for them to watch the movie, I'm not trying to brag or build myself up or anything, but bear with me if I say I watched that movie probably different than almost anybody else. I didn't just watch it as a good mechanic who knows the eloquent flying ability of an L10-11, but how many passengers were aware of that extraordinary piece of machinery that was destroyed? How many people could understand that death is a good thing, not a bad thing? How many people can have a spouse or a very close relative die and just smile and comfortably know that my father is okay and that there will be no bereavement? How many people can do that? I mean, accurately, I mean, truly do that. Some people can be very intellectual and callous and block and various other things, but the combination of things that I experienced through that plane crash and ongoing, I have to say is weird. In other words, the combination of things. Can I see it as a spiritual person who wants to hug everybody? Yes, I can. Can I be emotionally directly involved and attached to the individuals in that plane crash? I was. So watching that movie was a good thing for me, and it didn't amount to, in other words, it didn't really change me at all. But the part that made it more comfortable was for me to view it with the attitude of looking for discrepancies. In other words, looking for things that were not accurate, such as when the dialogue, when they portrayed the plane crashing, and the computer itself has a voice, and it says, pull up. In other words, in the movie, you can hear the computer stating mechanically, pull up, and that continues right on through the crash. That was accurate enough, and that was the type of voice that, in reality, that in the real event sounded like that. But at the same time, there were two bells, a dinging bell and then a steady ringing bell, which was not portrayed at all, which was on the voice recorders in the real event. Now, see, I know that. The investigators, I'm sure, will have known that because they will have listened directly to the tapes. But in the movie, it made it not real.
Yeah.
So it was a little more comfortable for me to view that. Also, for instance, the portrayal of, some of the characters that they portrayed. You know that they were portraying a particular person in the event, such as the wife of the mechanic that was killed in the car. And also, like, the portrayal of the crashed car did not look anything like the car that was left on the expressway that day. And
You
also,
said some of the characters were composite of
yes,
many personalities.
yeah, some of the women that were passengers that were saying that they were fearful of flying and that they know they're not going to make it and that the plane is going to crash ahead of time. That was a composite of several people's attitude focused in onto what I'm also sure is one particular woman who I won't mention who survived the crash and was publicized because very quickly she publicly said what it was like. And let's see. I was going to say some of the things that she said, but I guess maybe I shouldn't. For instance, how did she possibly get out of the seat that she was hanging from? Meaning she was at an angle almost upside down, and that there was no way for her to unbuckle her seatbelt, and that she stated that the horrendous amount of assistance that was given, the medical rescuers and so on, but that her attitude was calmed down by spirit, and these aren't her exact words, by spiritually knowing that people cared and people were helping. What else?
I think you probably answered this question, but I think to make it apply in people's lives who are watching the video, you know, what do we do when we receive information that are of a precognitive nature?
Yeah.
How much responsibility do we have to try, you know, we can't really change what is, but I know in this particular instance you certainly wished you could have.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, again, to kind of reiterate or say again, what Tom Sawyer did wrong during those months prior to that is I took upon myself knowing, first of all, I mean, no, there's knowing, the word K-N-O-W. I knew that had to take place. It was spiritual information told me this will take place, and that plane has to crash on this date and in these general circumstances. The wind shear, which was the mechanical fault, other judgmental things that I know for myself, and me being judgmental, I blame on the crash, which is different than the official decision. And it's because of additional pieces of information that I have that I could never share with the investigators, and for what purpose?
Right.
Notice, do we want to point the finger at him or her or him? That doesn't matter. Notice the event took place, and mechanically they see that the Doppler effect radar, the wind shear devices should be at the end of runways. We have them in existence. We have the technology. If this were in place, it would have demanded the pilot to go around. The pilot would not have been given part of the responsibility of making that type of a decision. God forbid he should make an incorrect decision. There's implications there, and that doesn't help society. So, to alleviate the pilot of as many decisions as possible, and to mechanically, and instrumentally demand that, like a red alert and pull up before they enter the wind shear. So things like that is what is important after the fact. As far as what I did wrong, like taking on the responsibility of knowing that it has to take place, but within myself I decided I know too much about this and this is too important. And even the arrogant attitude, I, Tom Sawyer, don't want the safest airplane in the air to crash. I mean, to me that's not justifiable. In other words, don't ever hesitate getting on a Lockheed L10-11. I mean, they are, in my opinion, the safest commercial jumbo jet in the air. Equal in every way to a 747. I better not say about too many planes. You and I might be on one of the on one of the lesser of the safest airplanes in the near future. So we will not talk about DC-10s.
So we'll just rattle and roll to our destination.
Yes.
Safely.
But anyway, what I was saying was to take on the responsibility of deciding that I don't care what I know, spiritually speaking, I'm going to see if I can find this airport. I'm going to see if I can find out when it happens. And if and when I find out exactly when it happens, the probability, what I'm trying to tell you, the probability is that I'll do something to divert that flight, stop that flight, make a phone call, which I've never done before. In other words, with the information that this has to take place, we as responsible individuals, usually information comes spiritually also, that this is how much you can do, here are some alternatives, and that's it. In other words, you know enough. And this, I took it upon myself to try to override and do a one-upsmanship to the spiritual flow of destiny. I don't know if you understand that sense, but and that was incorrect of me, and therefore I paid the price. I took on some responsibilities that I have in my history now, my spiritual history at least, that I'll have to deal with in my next life review, that I'll have to deal with when I become totally spiritual and no longer have the psychology and emotions of the humanistic part of Tom Sawyer. Notice here right now. And I will pay the price. I'm not saying that I'll be punished or so on and so on, but that will have to be dealt with. And if there is a price to pay, like any kind of extraordinary amounts of spiritual energy that I manipulated, well, then I'll have to conserve that. I'll have to pay the price of the law of conservation, spiritually speaking. And I'm prepared to do that. I'm aware of a great deal of that right now, and I'm prepared to pay that price. I decided to do that. But we, you, and everybody else have to be very, very careful. The caution here is be very careful as to how much you take on. The casual attitude to say, well, wait a minute, if you know a plane is going to crash, you owe it to society to stop it. And that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous because if it's something that has to be, well, maybe your part in it is just to further your education. Or, bear with me if I say this, to prepare you personally for another event similar. Or, how am I able to go and get the lost little girl and be callous enough to deal with certain aspects of it? Will I be a better mechanic knowing that it's very important to have things correct? Will I be more compassionate having dealt with the very real humanistic emotions of the people involved in that plane crash? And will I be able to be more compassionate toward my family, toward you? And the answer is yes to all of that. So again, the justification of having knowledge like this or having gone through something like what I've described in its entirety, there are many, many aspects that justify it all. In other words, was it an opportunity for me to test myself? In other words, how arrogant or how righteous can I get? And can I be so righteous in my mind that I can override spiritual knowledge and misuse or manipulate spiritual knowledge? The answer to that is yes. I mean, those the opportunities are there, the ability is there. Now, as to what I ever finally do or don't do, it's partially up to me and partially up to spiritual matters that are manipulated from the other side, whether it's by the light or by God. What was the other part of that statement? Because you actually asked a question for him. You said, what can we learn from this?
What could other people feel they should do in terms of if they get precognitive information, and what responsibility do they have to act on?
All right. If any of you or if I get a precognition of any nature, any kind, there are different types. There's the types where you get the knowledge and you know that you have to know it and that's it. That pretty much sizes it all up, because no matter what you do, striving or trying to change or alter or become overly involved or not, or totally shunning it totally, you just won't do it because it's predestined.
Right.
This is information that you have to know. You may not have an explanation, you may not have any kind of rationale regarding it, but that's it. So that covers that. And there's not much else to say about that. Some are wonderful, some are tragic, some you simply have to know about it. And tough. Shrug of the shoulders. That's part of life, if you will. Okay, but then there are other types where you can know of a future event that is changeable. Now, the most horrendous in this part of the century, practically, if I can claim that, because I wasn't alone. I don't have to claim this for a Tom Sawyer thing. I was part of it on a global scale, as a matter of fact. The nuclear detonation, which was zeroed right in on. In fact, I think the closest I came to was saying by August 15th, meaning no sooner than July, but no later than August 15th of 1988. And I mean, that was very accurate. That was also 100% real. It was no figment of anybody's imagination. This was global in scale. There were several other people who had this for more than 10 years of precognition. I don't mean, I think by the end of the century there'll be a nuclear detonation. No, that's either fakery or such low-level psychic awareness that the probability of a earthquake or the probability of a nuclear detonation before the turn of the century, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you have genuine precognition of factual nature to one degree or another. As we all dealt with that, or a majority of the people dealt with that, even my shared knowledge talking to you and people like the people that will be viewing this tape, that I have knowledge and I want to share it with you. And I told you that even though I'm fair and I say there will be the highest of probability, I knew that it would be if things were allowed to go as they were. The alternative was, which was information given to me spiritually, was that if I can change some of my attitude, if the world in general, the populace of the world would change their attitude alone, in other words, an attitudinal change more toward love than material and hatred and righteousness and vendettas and all those things that are handicaps for us in the long run, at least in the long run, they're tragedies, they're handicaps. You may justify them at the moment, but they're not going to be justified in your life review. You may say, well, you hit me, I had to hit you back, and I was justified. In the eyes of the law, it's okay, I'm vindicated. Yeah? Wait till the life review. Or wait till 2 months from now when you find you have to be with that person, either in a business relationship, or you might need the assistance or help of that person that you righteously got the better of. I mean, it's a wonderful thing that the person you shake your fist at and scream and yell in the traffic jam, knowing that you'll never see that person, turns out to be your boss in the near future, or it turns out to be your next-door neighbor. I mean, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. There are many things we can do. You have to deal with it very carefully. You have to deal with it intelligently. You have to be, one of the things you have to be careful of is don't run right out and start bragging. That's something that's delightful. It's fun. And I'm being honest. I mean, some of the things that I brag about, I brag, and it's fun, and hey, wow. And there's no denying that. The sensationalism involved in that, you have to be careful to not feed on that. I mean, there's many examples that I've given before of one individual who became clinically, or practically clinically dead only because of the sensationalism and the greed, therefore, the greed of the sensationalism. And he, a good friend of mine, almost died only from the greed. And then the ego that feeds off of the greed. Goes to the sensationalism of feeding off your greed gains ego. You may become egotistical, or that spiritual ego that is not healthy, and it can kill you. It can physically kill you, can disrupt you, to say the least. And Mark Evans is a perfect example of that, almost the ultimate example of that. And he's doing okay now, having gone through that.
He was in a coma, was he?
Yes, he was in a hospital bed, dying. The doctors threw up their arms and said, this man, there is nothing wrong with this man, and he's dying. And one thing led to another, and with assistance from a lot of people, which I was indirectly, kind of directly involved in.
Having to do with him having precognitions that he couldn't handle?
Well, see, that's not true to state that way.
Yeah.
He had many, many precognitions, and he could have handled all of them. But he sensationalized the sensationalistic aspect of them, and he even sold. In other words, you come to my house, and for $5, I'll share with you some future events. And even though that can be done for some people in a certain way, because I'm not criticizing and condemning people who give readings, futuristic readings, okay? I'm not condemning that. It's not the same thing I'm talking about. And I'm saying that if you are balanced, and I like to point to, your heart chakra and so on, if you're balanced in that and using that as a justifiable or a righteous facilitation to assist and love people, even if it's done for an income, if you have to do that for an income, I'm not judging that either. I'm not talking about that same thing. I'm talking about that which I did with the plane crash, that Mark Evans did with many precognitions of all different natures. And he sensationalized that, and it devastated him. I mean, he lost his security in his family, he lost his finances, he lost practically everything. And he had to, quote-unquote, start all over again. And he's doing okay now, God bless him. I mean, and he's where he should be right now in view of his acts of free will. Be careful of your acts of free will and what they're based on. Be very careful because, for instance, you can say, this is such extraordinary information, you should know about this. And I mean, I know things right now that I want to share with you, and you would do well to know it. But where do you draw the line? And I right now have to draw the line that I'm not going to share with you a few things that I know. Excuse me, in other words, judging everything. You know, so many things are a trade-off. If I become a psychic, if I become a well-known psychic, there's a trade-off. My phone is going to be ringing for the types of phone calls that I shouldn't be bothered with. They're of no value to me, and in the long run, they'll be of little or no value to the person calling. Are you the one in the Enquirer magazine? Click. And that did a lot of good for the caller. Did it do any good for me? Yeah. Rang my phone, interrupted me, and I had to say, oh, there's somebody else sensationalizing that they saw my picture, my name in the Enquirer magazine. Those things, be careful of that. You say, I'd like to be a movie star. Whoa, movie stars sometimes work 16 hours a day, 20 hours a day, and they're very lonely at times. I mean, you think it's take for granted. You go to the shopping center, you walk around and buy a new pair of shoes. If you're very famous, you can't do that. You can't do that comfortably. I mean, look, the little bit that I've been public, and because I've been very choosy and so on, I've been in restaurants and have people come and interrupt Elaine and my dinner and saying, I'm the 99% of the people, and I can't complain about that because it's been done in good taste, and both Elaine and I, or especially me, have never been devastated by my popularity, my fame. I mean the dictionary definition of famous. Because if you're well-known, why are you well-known, and what does that mean? I've been prepared for that, and I've taken that. I've coped with that very well. So regarding anything that you might be dealing with, think of those things ahead of time. And I mean, think them all the way through.
What do you really want, and what does it really mean when you get it?
And you can deceive yourself into saying, oh no, I'm doing this as a love gesture, when you're really building your own ego. Because I want to be known as a hugger, therefore I hug. That isn't the right motivation. That's not correct. It's okay if you're known as a hugger or not, and that you should want to hug somebody spontaneously because the opportunity is there, and you will feel good making them feel good, and you know that they will feel good receiving that from you, and you'll get whatever you get out of that. Is that more unconditional trade-off? I should say a thing or two quickly about in hindsight of the event. because, for instance, one minor little detail is that some of the details that I'm aware of now, right, that I have been aware of, should really never be brought to light, that phrase brought to light, or made public. In other words, what good would it do for me to give information to a surviving relative how traumatic it was for their spouse, or how non-traumatic. In other words, in the last few minutes, not even minutes, in the last few seconds of the plane flight, when it was obvious that something was terribly wrong. In other words, when they bounced off the field, they didn't really experience the car being crushed. And the people on the plane did not really experience that. The jarring and G-forces of coming back up off the field, it was just like part of that. In other words, they didn't experience a separate event of the trucks or the tires crushing the car on the expressway where the mechanic died. What did the mechanic in the car experience? I will publicly share that I'm aware of the last few seconds, and of course he was dealing with his birthday, the extraordinary, beautiful love of his wife and kids. In other words, he was just like mulling over in his mind. It was his birthday, his family was back, I believe in Mississippi, and he can't wait to bring him out to Texas because he's getting financially squared away now. He's got a full-time job, all the joy of that, and dealing with how much he appreciated his uncle staying at his house temporarily while he got the new residence established. And that wasn't portrayed in the movie, I don't think. Again, I'm going off in too many details, personalized details, but he was so proud that he had already made arrangements for things. And see, I don't know how much his wife even knows today as to how much he had already done for the new residents. I'll say it that way. And that part of the phone conversation, the surprise happy birthday, would be additional details that, guess what? You can come out here sooner.
Yeah.
Those sort of things. Of what value is that to the spouse, to his wife? Probably none at all in the long run. And yet, compassionately, to know that he experienced a minimal of discomfort. In other words, in time frame, it was like mulling all these beautiful, wonderful things over in his mind and kind of coping with the obvious storm coming, which was just reaching him. And as he was in the rain part of it and the severe gusty winds, and then to just be there and just quickly look like that. And then, in other words, how traumatic was that? Well, to just go, there was not even enough time to take a breath before he was in a clinical death state, an unconscious state, not able to breathe, and so on. And that was the actual physical death part of it, because it happened so quickly and so dramatically that his body was just crushed. All right? Now, if we can have compassion for somebody who dies of cancer over a 3-year period or a prolonged oncoming death, judgmentally we take a little bit of comfort into knowing that, well, he didn't die a long, prolonged death. He had an aneurysm and he died in a few seconds. In other words, he was out of pain in a half of a minute. So regarding the mechanic, it would be fair to say that he was not in any physical trauma at all to speak of, other than the amount of time of seeing something abnormal, which was, in his perception, if I dare say that, just this large, dark thing. In other words, if a snowball hits the side of your car window, yeah, at the moment you don't even know what it is, and it's a shocking thing. And then you have to stop and see and then say, oh, it's a snowball. All right, well, none of that time was taken. In other words, he did, with his physical eyes, look to the side window and see what we know is the wheels. He didn't know it was wheels. He didn't know it was an airplane. He knew just instantly that it was something not good. And then he was unconscious, not able to function in any respect. Notice he was already at a state of clinical death. And that's very beautiful because that then automatically propelled him into the clinical death state, which we know as the onset of the near-death experience. And that is judgmentally a good thing, not a bad thing, regardless of how much of a life review he had and the circumstances of his transition into what we say is death, which is just the future life that we're going to be living very differently from what we live now. So there can be a degree of comfort in say, giving information like that to a spouse, but other circumstances where there was a severe burning, prolonged agony, if you will, that's pretty much worthless. If we're so spiritually evolved, we know that the physical trauma, the psychological trauma in a death, an oncoming death state, meaning the thing that you die from, the act of dying. The act of dying can be painful and gross. That's okay, that's justifiable, because spiritually we often know that the trauma that you experience in your life is for a purpose. No, all the physical pain isn't totally justifiable. Some you bring on yourself, some is accidental, some is... But spiritually, most of us know that there is a cause and effect relationship, and it's usually justifiable. So in that respect, we can deal with the sadness of the tragedy involved. As I'm talking, I'm missing something that I wanted to include in this taping, because we talked about the precognition aspect of it. How do you deal with things of this nature? How am I able to cope with the psychological aspects of it alone? And those very often, let me state that there's a new phrase like post-stress syndrome or post-trauma syndrome. Kind of came out of the Vietnam War, post-combat stress and things like that. And I've been questioned several times by many clinicians and so on. Tom, have you ever heard of such a thing? Because they didn't want to suggest it to me either. So very carefully they said, how are you able to deal with things that we would never expect a professional clinician or a professional emergency medical technician who might deal with this on a daily basis? You're none of those things. And how can you function normally? How can you go to sleep at night? And I don't have a good explanation for that, but let me put it this way. With the extraordinary experience initially I had with the near-death experience, and being part of that light, that says it all. I mean, all the stuff that we deal with as our priorities, right now watching this film, this taping is a priority, and oh gee, we're learning new things about precognitions and that, it's a priority. Well, wait a minute, are you suddenly forgetting about the thing you did bad last night? See, the thing you did naughty or bad last night isn't a priority. And it's like nothingness. It's part of your history, and it is you, but it's not a priority anymore. And I'll sound like I'm bragging, but I've got an extraordinary ability so far, not talking about tomorrow, of emotionally and psychologically on the humanistic level, to prioritize and rationalize, why me? Why do I have to know this? Why did I know this ahead of time? Will there be things that I'm shocked about? And the answer is yes, there will. I mean, I'm sure that there will be within the next couple of days. Will Todd be able to call me in the next 48 hours or so and say, Dad, thanks so much for warning me about whatever this day is? Will that be joyous for me, or will that be traumatic for me? It doesn't really matter in the long run, because I do have, which I'm counting on, I mean, hopefully I can count on, this overriding, or shall I say underlying, awareness of the light at the end of the tunnel. And that no matter how traumatic and bad things are, no matter how I deal with things in general, that it'll all come out in the wash, and that'll all be either justifiable or that it'll just be understood. But at least it will be understood. And that our job is to try to understand now. If we succeed or not, it isn't so important as long as we try. And that full understanding will be had by everybody in their transitional state in their life review or in the next life. How'd that sound?
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you, and I love you.